December 7, 1941. The morning sun cast long shadows across Pearl Harbor as Seaman First Class James Mitchell wiped the sleep from his eyes aboard the USS Arizona. At precisely 7:55 a.m., the tranquil Hawaiian dawn erupted into chaos. Japanese Nakajima torpedo bombers screamed overhead, their engines drowning out the Sunday morning calm. Within minutes, the harbor transformed from a peaceful naval base into a hellscape of burning steel and desperate screams. Admiral Husband Kimmel stood frozen on his headquarters balcony, watching in horror as the battleship row became a graveyard of twisted metal. The Arizona exploded in a massive fireball, taking over 1,000 sailors to their watery grave. The Oklahoma capsized, trapping hundreds beneath her hull. As black smoke billowed into the tropical sky, America's Pacific Fleet lay crippled, but not broken. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt received the devastating news while reviewing naval documents in the White House. His advisor, Harry Hopkins, burst into the Oval Office with trembling hands, delivering the intelligence that would change the course of history. "Mr. President," Hopkins stammered, "the Japanese have attacked Pearl Harbor." Roosevelt's jaw tightened as he absorbed the magnitude of the assault. The United States had been thrust into a global conflict it had desperately tried to avoid. Tokyo, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, felt a profound unease despite the tactical success. He had studied at Harvard University and understood American industrial capacity better than most of his peers. "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve," he confided to his aide. Yamamoto knew that Japan had perhaps 6 months to secure decisive victories before American production capabilities would overwhelm the empire. This account draws from contemporary reports in the New York Times archives from December 8, 1941. Story. Attack lasted just 90 minutes, but its consequences would ripple across the Pacific for nearly 4 years. 2,400 Americans lay dead, with another 1,200 wounded. 8 battleships were damaged or destroyed, along with numerous cruisers, destroyers, and aircraft. Yet the Japanese had made a critical error. They had failed to destroy Pearl Harbor's fuel storage facilities and repair yards, infrastructure that would prove vital in the coming campaign. As rescue crews worked through the night, pulling survivors from the oily waters, America's resolve crystallized. The isolationist movement that had dominated pre-war politics evaporated overnight. Congress would declare war the following day with only one dissenting vote. The Pacific Ocean, once a barrier protecting American shores, would now become the stage for the most decisive naval campaign in human history. The die was cast. Japan had achieved tactical surprise but strategic miscalculation. The sleeping giant was indeed awakening, and its industrial might would soon turn the vast Pacific into a highway of retribution. From the burning harbor of Pearl to the distant atolls of the Central Pacific, an epic struggle for naval supremacy was about to begin. December 1941. June 1942. Lieutenant General Tomoyuki Yamashita's 25th Army swept through the supposedly impregnable fortress of Singapore like a typhoon through bamboo. British General Arthur Percival, commanding over 80,000 troops, found himself outmaneuvered by a force half his size. The fall of Singapore on February 15, 1942, sent shockwaves throughout the Allied world. The myth of Western invincibility in Asia crumbled as Japanese forces captured over 100,000 British, Australian, and Indian prisoners. In the Philippines, General Douglas MacArthur watched his forces retreat to the Bataan Peninsula as Japanese divisions under General Masaharu Homma pressed their relentless advance. The once proud American and Filipino defenders, cut off from supplies and reinforcements, fought with dwindling ammunition and empty stomachs. MacArthur himself was ordered to evacuate to Australia, leaving behind his famous promise, "I shall return." The bitter irony was not lost on the men left behind. Their commanding general had escaped while they faced inevitable capture or death. The Japanese juggernaut seemed unstoppable. Hong Kong fell after 18 days of desperate resistance. The Dutch East Indies, with its precious oil resources, surrendered after brief but fierce fighting. Burma's teak forests echoed with the sounds of retreating British forces as Lieutenant General Shojiro Iida's armies pushed toward India. In just 5 months, the Empire of Japan had conquered an area larger than Europe, stretching from the Aleutian Islands to the edge of Australia. Admiral Chester Nimitz arrived at Pearl Harbor in late December to assume command of the Pacific Fleet, surveying the still smoldering wreckage of America's naval might. The soft-spoken Texan faced a seemingly impossible task: halt Japanese expansion with a crippled fleet while simultaneously building the forces necessary for eventual counterattack. His carriers, Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga, had fortunately escaped the Pearl Harbor attack, providing the nucleus around which American resistance would crystallize. These strategic assessments align with military analyses published in Time magazine during the spring of 1942. The Doolittle raid on April 18, 1942, provided America's first taste of revenge. Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle led 16 North American B-25 bombers from the carrier USS Hornet, striking Tokyo and other Japanese cities. While the material damage was minimal, the psychological impact was enormous. Japanese citizens, assured by their government that the home islands were invulnerable, watched American bombers fly overhead with impunity. Emperor Hirohito himself was forced to take shelter as bombs fell near the imperial palace. The raid infuriated Japanese military leadership and accelerated their plans for a decisive battle. Admiral Yamamoto, convinced that America's carrier force must be eliminated before it could threaten future operations, began planning the most ambitious naval campaign in Japanese history. His target, the strategic island of Midway, positioned like a sentry in the Central Pacific. As spring turned to early summer, both navies prepared for a confrontation that would determine the Pacific War's trajectory. Japanese confidence remained high after 6 months of uninterrupted victories, but American codebreakers had begun penetrating enemy communications. The stage was set for a battle that would prove the turning point of the entire Pacific campaign. The rising sun had reached its zenith. Now, as American industrial production began hitting its stride and new ships joined the fleet, the question remained: could Japan's early victories be sustained, or would American resilience and resources eventually prevail? Chapter 2. June 19. 42 in a cramped basement beneath the Pearl Harbor Administration Building, Commander Joseph Rochefort hunched over stacks of intercepted Japanese radio transmissions. His combat intelligence unit, known as Station Hypo, had been working around the clock to penetrate the enemy's naval code designated JN-25. The brilliant cryptanalyst, wearing his trademark red smoking jacket and bedroom slippers, sensed they were on the verge of a breakthrough that could change the war's course. Rochefort's team had detected increased Japanese radio chatter, mentioning a location identified only as AF. Through painstaking analysis and a clever ruse, having Midway Island radio a false report about water problems, they confirmed that AF was indeed Midway Atoll. The intelligence revealed Admiral Yamamoto's ambitious plan: a massive assault on Midway designed to lure the remaining American carriers into a decisive battle where they could be destroyed. Admiral Nimitz faced an agonizing decision. Station Hypo's intelligence indicated that Yamamoto was approaching with 4 aircraft carriers, 11 battleships, and over 150 supporting vessels, the largest naval armada Japan had ever assembled. Against this force, Nimitz could muster only 3 carriers: Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown, which had limped back from the Coral Sea battle with significant damage still visible on her flight deck. The Battle of the Coral Sea in early May had provided both sides with crucial lessons. For the first time in naval history, opposing fleets had fought without ever seeing each other, relying entirely on aircraft launched from carriers hundreds of miles apart. The Americans had lost the carrier Lexington, but they had also turned back a Japanese invasion force heading for Port Moresby, marking Japan's first strategic defeat. More importantly, the battle had bloodied Japanese naval aviation, eliminating experienced pilots who would be sorely missed in the coming confrontation. Intelligence operations during this period are documented in classified Navy Department. Reports declassified in 1975, Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, commanding Task Force 17 aboard the Yorktown, supervised emergency repairs while his ship remained in dry dock. Navy Yard workers labored for 72 hours straight, patching holes, replacing damaged steel, and restoring the carrier's fighting capability. Under normal circumstances, such repairs would require months. Fletcher would have to make do, with a ship held together by determination and prayer. Meanwhile, Admiral Raymond Spruance assumed command of Task Force 16, built around the carriers Enterprise and Hornet. The cautious, methodical Spruance was an unusual choice to lead carrier operations. He was a surface warfare specialist who had never commanded aviation units. But Nimitz recognized his tactical brilliance and unflappable temperament under pressure. As American forces prepared for battle, Japanese confidence remained unshaken. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, who had led the Pearl Harbor attack, commanded the carrier striking force with supreme assurance. His pilots were veterans of 6 months of continuous victories, from Pearl Harbor to Ceylon. The 4 carriers under his command, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, represented the most experienced naval aviation force in the world. Yamamoto's plan was complex, perhaps too complex. He divided his forces into multiple groups, including a diversionary attack on the Aleutian Islands designed to draw American attention northward. The main assault would begin with airstrikes to neutralize Midway's defenses, followed by an amphibious landing. When American carriers inevitably appeared to defend the island, Nagumo's veterans would destroy them in a decisive engagement, but Admiral Nimitz, armed with Rochefort's intelligence, was already positioning his forces for an ambush. The Americans would not react to Japanese moves, they would anticipate them. June 4, 1942 at 4:30 a.m., under a star-studded Pacific sky, Admiral Nagumo launched the first wave of his attack on Midway Atoll. 108 Japanese aircraft, dive bombers, torpedo planes, and fighters roared off the flight decks of Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. The veteran pilots, many of whom had participated in the Pearl Harbor attack 6 months earlier, were confident this would be another routine destruction of American positions. Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga led the strike force toward the tiny coral atoll, barely 6 miles across but strategically positioned to threaten Japanese operations throughout the Central Pacific. As his formation approached Midway, American radar operators tracked their every movement. The island's defenders, forewarned by intercepted intelligence, scrambled every available aircraft to meet the incoming threat. The aerial battle over Midway was fierce, but brief. Marine Captain Marion Carl's Grumman Wildcats engaged the nimble Mitsubishi Zeros in desperate dogfights, while Japanese bombers pounded the island's facilities. Hangars erupted in flames, fuel storage tanks exploded, and the runway suffered significant damage. Yet the Americans had managed to launch most of their aircraft before the attack began, and Midway's essential installations remained operational. Lieutenant Tominaga, surveying the damage from his cockpit, made a crucial decision that would alter history's course. He radioed Admiral Nagumo. There is need for a second attack wave. This simple message triggered a chain of events that would doom the Japanese fleet. Nagumo, believing American carriers were still hundreds of miles away, ordered his reserve. Aircraft rearmed with land attack bombs instead of the armor-piercing weapons needed for naval warfare. Combat reports from Marine Fighter Squadron 221 provide detailed accounts of the morning air battles. Unknown to Nagumo, American dive. Bombers were already approaching his position. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, leading Enterprise's air group, had made a fateful navigation decision when he failed to find the Japanese fleet at its expected location. Instead of returning to his carrier, he continued searching and spotted the wake of a Japanese destroyer racing northward to rejoin the main force. Following this slender thread across the vast Pacific, McCluskey led his squadron directly to Nagumo's carriers. At 10:24 a.m., 3 American dive bomber squadrons converged on the Japanese fleet simultaneously in one of warfare's most remarkable coincidences. McCluskey's Enterprise group approached from the southwest, while Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie's Yorktown squadron attacked from the southeast. The Japanese carriers, caught in the middle of rearming and refueling operations, were floating, ammunition dumps waiting to explode. The first bomb struck Akagi's flight deck, detonating among aircraft loaded with fuel and ordnance. Secondary explosions rippled through the ship as aviation gasoline ignited, turning the proud flagship into an inferno. Kaga suffered a similar fate as multiple bombs penetrated her hangar deck, setting off a chain reaction of explosions that would eventually consume the entire vessel. Soryu, attacked by Yorktown's dive bombers, erupted in flames as her stored torpedoes and bombs exploded in sympathetic detonations. Within minutes, 3 of Japan's 4 fleet carriers were burning wrecks, their experienced air crews trapped in the conflagration or scattered across the Pacific. The cream of Japanese naval aviation, built up over years of training and combat, was being incinerated in a matter of moments. Admiral Nagumo, aboard the burning Akagi, watched in stunned disbelief as his veteran fleet carriers transformed into floating pyres. The carefully planned operation was disintegrating before his eyes, victim of American intelligence, timing, and the fortunes of war. June 4th, 5th, 1942. From the bridge of the burning Akagi, Admiral Nagumo surveyed the catastrophe, engulfing his fleet. 3 of his 4 carriers were ablaze, their flight decks twisted by explosions and their hangars transformed into furnaces. The acrid smoke of burning aviation fuel mixed with the screams of trapped sailors as damage control. Parties fought desperately to contain the infernos. Nagumo's chief of staff, Captain Ryunosuke Kusaka, urgently recommended transferring the admiral's flag to the light cruiser Nagara as Akagi's ammunition lockers began detonating in secondary explosions. Captain Ryusaku Yanagimoto of the Soryu chose to go down with his ship, standing at attention on the bridge as flames consumed the carrier around him. His final message to the fleet epitomized the samurai spirit that had driven Japanese expansion. "I am grateful for the opportunity to serve the Emperor." The Soryu's surviving crew members saluted their captain one final time before abandoning ship, knowing they would never see him again. The sole surviving Japanese carrier, Hiryu, under Captain Tomeo Kaku's command, launched a desperate counterattack. Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi led 18 dive bombers and 6 fighters toward the American fleet, guided by reconnaissance aircraft that had located the Yorktown. The Japanese pilots, driven by vengeance for their fallen comrades, pressed their attack with suicidal determination, despite overwhelming American fighter opposition. Yorktown, commanded by Captain Elliot Buckmaster, absorbed 3 bomb hits that penetrated her flight deck and started fierce fires below. The carrier's damage. Control teams, trained to Navy perfection, managed to restore partial operations within an hour. But a second wave from Hiryu, this time torpedo bombers led by Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga, struck the already wounded ship with 2 devastating torpedo hits that knocked out her power and caused a severe port list. The heroic damage control efforts aboard Yorktown are documented in official Navy action reports filed in July 1942. Admiral Fletcher, recognizing that his flagship was mortally wounded, transferred tactical command to Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance aboard Enterprise. The methodical Spruance, though new to carrier warfare, quickly organized a strike against the last Japanese flat top. Lieutenant Commander Earl Gallagher led 24 dive bombers from Enterprise in the afternoon attack that would seal Japan's fate in the Central Pacific. Hiryu's destruction followed the same pattern as her sister ships. American bombs penetrated her flight deck and detonated among fueled and armed aircraft, creating an unstoppable conflagration. Captain Kaku, following the Bushido Code, chose to remain aboard his dying ship rather than face the shame of survival. By evening, all 4 of Admiral Nagumo's fleet carriers had been reduced to blazing hulks drifting across the darkening Pacific. Admiral Yamamoto, monitoring the battle from his flagship Yamato 300 miles to the west, initially refused to believe the magnitude of the disaster. When the full scope of the defeat became clear, the architect of Pearl Harbor faced his greatest professional crisis. His combined fleet had suffered its first major defeat, losing not just 4 irreplaceable carriers, but also the cream of Japanese naval aviation, pilots whose experience could never be replaced. The submarine USS Nautilus, which had been dodging Japanese depth charges all day, delivered the coup de grace to the abandoned Soryu with a spread of torpedoes. The carrier, still burning after hours of uncontrolled fires, finally slipped beneath the waves as her magazine exploded in a final, spectacular detonation that could be seen for miles across the Pacific. As night fell on June 4th, the balance of naval power in the Pacific had fundamentally shifted. Japan's offensive capability lay shattered on the ocean floor, while American industrial production was just hitting its stride. The rising sun had reached its zenith and begun its inexorable descent toward the setting horizon. June 5th, 1942. Epilogue. The morning of June 5th dawned gray and somber over waters littered with debris from the previous days. Carnage. Captain Elliot Buckmaster made the agonizing decision to abandon the Yorktown as her list increased and flooding spread beyond the damage control team's ability to contain. The carrier that had survived the Coral Sea and fought valiantly at Midway was finally succumbing to her wounds, though she would remain afloat for 2 more days before a Japanese submarine delivered the final blow. Admiral Yamamoto, his face drawn with the weight of defeat, ordered the combined fleet's withdrawal. The master strategist who had predicted Japan's ultimate failure if the war extended beyond 6 months now confronted that prophecy's fulfillment. His meticulously planned operation had not only failed, but had cost Japan her 4 most valuable carriers and over 3,000 experienced airmen whose skills represented years of intensive training that could never be replaced. In Washington, President Roosevelt received news of the victory with quiet satisfaction rather than celebration. The pragmatic commander-in-chief understood that Midway represented a turning point, not the war's end. "This battle has given us the initiative," he told Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox, "but we must be prepared for a long struggle ahead." American industrial capacity was indeed reaching full production, with new Essex-class carriers already under construction that would dwarf anything currently at sea. The human cost of victory weighed heavily on American commanders. 307 Americans had died in the battle, including Torpedo Squadron 8's entire complement of aircrews, who had pressed their attacks despite obsolescent aircraft and overwhelming enemy fighter opposition. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron and his men had flown to certain death, buying precious time for the dive bombers who would ultimately sink the Japanese carriers. Post-battle analysis conducted by the Navy Department's Bureau of Aeronautics provides detailed assessments of tactical lessons learned during the Midway engagement. Admiral Nimitz, reviewing battle reports in his Pearl Harbor headquarters, recognized that American success had resulted from superior intelligence rather than superior tactics or equipment. Station Hypo's code-breaking efforts had provided the crucial advantage that enabled a smaller force to defeat a larger, more experienced enemy. The victory validated America's investment in communications intelligence and set the pattern for future Pacific operations. Japanese losses extended far beyond the 4 sunken carriers. The Midway defeat had eliminated the veteran aircrews who formed the backbone of Japanese naval aviation. These experienced pilots, many with hundreds of combat hours, could not be quickly replaced. Japan's training programs, optimized for quality over quantity, required years to produce competent aviators. America's training establishments, by contrast, were already graduating thousands of new pilots monthly, using standardized methods that prioritized rapid throughput. The strategic implications became clear within months of the battle. Japan, stripped of her offensive capability, was forced into a defensive posture throughout the Central Pacific. American forces, reinforced by new construction and freed from the threat of further Japanese expansion, began planning offensive operations that would carry the war to Japan's doorstep. Admiral King, Chief of Naval Operations, summarized the battle's significance in his post-war memoirs. Midway was the turning point of the Pacific War because it shifted the strategic initiative permanently to the United States. After June 4, 1942, Japan could only react to American moves rather than initiate her own operations. The Battle of Midway had indeed transformed the Pacific Ocean from Japan's highway of conquest into America's avenue of approach. The sleeping giant, fully awakened, was preparing to unleash industrial and military power that would ultimately prove unstoppable. The sea of decision had rendered its verdict, and the long road to Tokyo Bay had begun.